Where are we with whiteness in America, and how did we get here?
Yeah.
In 3, 4 minutes or less. No,
Okay.
kidding.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
Well,
Just kidding.
let me start by saying how happy I am to be here and how glad this is supper time in the Midwest. So for people to come out at 5 o'clock at night, I was skeptical, and thanks for coming. And apologies to those who had lunch. I only have so many little bits of knowledge, and so there'll be repetition. I won't repeat any jokes, but some of the analysis will be repeated. I think it's important to think about tone when we begin to address these matters. I was trained by Sterling Stuckey, the great African-American historian, and the first thing he'd often say about writing is, what tone are you trying to strike here? If you're writing about slavery, what's the tone? And I think that the Trump experience, for those of us on the left and who've been studying these things, invites a kind of panic, first of all, but also a kind of self-congratulation that now is the moment where people are finally going to have to listen to us. And it is true that everywhere I go now, the crowds are much, much larger than they would be otherwise, and I get that. But I think the tone has to still be a kind of a humble tone, right? That we have been trying, we have had ideas. I didn't foresee Trump. Did you?
Not immediately, but pretty soon, about halfway through, I was like, okay, this would really
Halfway through the
happen.
night or the election campaign?
No, around July, August, before the election.
Okay. So on election night, you knew that Trump would win?
I was in a fantasy land. I was like, nah, I was just worried about nothing. And then I went into a complete sweating panic.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah. But no, I just thought, this is really possible for a lot of reasons. It was more just sort of calculations.
So I think we need to stay in that moment of humility that grows out of how unexpected this was, even if this is kind of our life's work to study these matters. I didn't get it. All of my undergraduate African-American women students said, well, of course Trump will win. And I said, I don't think so. I just don't see it. And I had also kind of, in my work, imagined that white nationalism doesn't have very much to do with everyday whiteness in the United States, that it's kind of a separate thing, and that there's a line between the far right's whiteness and the ways that people are mostly oppressed. Now, when you begin to talk about police and jails, and guards, there's a different dynamic to that. But now I think, and this is part of what you're raising, that there is a moment now where we have to really talk about what it is to have a white nationalist president, and what it says about the larger ways that whiteness rules.
Right. The thing that surprised me the most was not that there was this, core group of white nationalists that were being brought out of the woodworks, but how much everyday, ordinary, not just whites, but sort of middle-of-the-road liberals of all backgrounds didn't ultimately read the politics as white nationalism right away. I remember saying, we have a white nationalist government. People are like, oh, we just elected a white supremacist president. Oh, you're so dramatic, Tricia. You're so, and I think, no, I'm really not. I was like, that's what we did. And yet, it took people, it seems, not all people, but a number of people you would have expected to immediately be hysterical, to read it differently. Did you have that experience?
Yes, and I was trying to puzzle out factions in the administration and say, well, if it's Bannon today and then he's on the outs and this is a defeat for the white nationalists. But none of those factional groupings have persisted, really. It kind of runs through people. And yet this core, the reflex that when you're in trouble, you go to a white nationalist appeal, I think that's the core of it, rather than this group of advisors or that group of advisors.
Yeah, although the ones that remain are pretty well entrenched, in any event. So is Trump then sort of a a symbol of a long-standing set of practices? Is this the long march of the origins of white supremacy in the West in this formation, or is there something different? I mean, how much of this is new, and how much of it has a level of meaningful continuity?
I think both. I think it's an elaboration of things that were happening for a long time. I tried to write about for a while and did a little bit right-wing talk radio, and I think that, and listened to a lot of right-wing talk radio in the Midwest, and I think that, there's a fair amount of the habits of Trump and really the habits of his listeners that grow out of that ability for a Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity to kind of posit themselves as the brave person who for the first time is saying what's being said in your home already along racial lines, along anti-immigrant lines. So I think that, that's very old. That's 30 or 40 years old on talk radio. And part of my problem is I don't know how seriously to take Trump obviously as a threat and a phenomenon, seriously, yes. But Bill Kristol, the neocon commentator who's now back to being a critic of Trump, has been saying on TV, we have to realize how smart Trump is. And that the worst thing that Trump's critics do is dismiss him as just unserious and random and,
Right.
And I get that. I don't want to be in a conversation about how smart Trump is. I think there is a certain way that randomness is what gets him over, and that he's not a political thinker, and that's different. I think that
right.
that the racists before racism would work conjoined to polling data. I don't think, except in a very general way, that Trump cares about polling data. And
right.
Yeah.
But I mean, he could be smart and unwell and wily all at once.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, there have been many maniacal smart people in history.
And maniacal in ways that are congenial to the larger society.
Absolutely.
And works.
Taps into certain,
Yeah.
feelings. But, I'm interested in this habit that you talked about, listeners on right-wing radio and commentators and anchors. I'm interested in, sort of the pattern of what happened in the wake of the civil rights movement, which is that produced this notion of reverse racism, right? That whites are at a disadvantage if the playing field is attempted to be leveled. And that the habit then is that what the victories of, say, just to be simplistic here, just the victories of the civil rights movement did was force a certain kind of white privilege into a certain kind of narrative silence, right? It created a silence. So, I mean, do you think that there's some truth potentially to having been a missing piece of the strategy, a kind of re-education program for whites, right, as opposed to just a legal change?
Yeah.
Because I'm really struck by how convinced, when I occasionally listen, because I don't have the stomach for right-wing radio. You're a bright, I just don't have it. But I get enough, and I figure I got the gist.
Yeah.
But this sense that of betrayal and being wronged, not by the business class, not by the billionaire elites, right, not by capitalism, but by immigrant people of color, African Americans, et cetera, that this is really where the harm has been done. And I'm just wondering, what that tells us, not just about whiteness, but also about political strategies that may or may not have been attempted.
I've been reading with my students this introduction to E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, and he talks about class being a relationship, and he thinks of it as a Marxist as a two-party relationship. He says there's no love without lovers, there's no deference without squires and laborers, and I think that one of the things we paid for is that for years, working people in the United States thought of themselves as middle class. That's changing a little bit. But who's the other for the middle class?
I'm not sure I understand.
How'd you get that to do that?
I just want you to know Siri never does what I say. I have cursed her out and she blames me for having bad language, but for the first time, I pressed to see the time and she wants to know what's going on. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry, David. She said, I'm sorry, I don't understand you. I'm like, yeah, that's no kidding. Okay. So yeah, back to A.P. Thompson.
Edward's point there is that we know our class by the others that we imagine.
Right.
And I think that kind of built into this idea that what was called the middle class now is being called the white working class. A middle class always has two others. It has a chance to look up and say, during Occupy, the genius of Occupy in some ways was that the 1% re-entered the conversation of U.S. politics, and you could look up and find your other. But it also has this opportunity to look down and find your other. In the state, the culture, I think, is much more congenial to having people who have their own economic grievances look down at somebody else than to look up at their enemies. And so I think we kind of see that develop now, that the middle classness or the hankering to be middle class takes the form sometimes. And I'm not wanting to imply that Trump was elected by white workers. We can talk about that later. But to the extent that he enjoyed support from people whose economic interests were not at all in supporting him, I think it's that temptation to say, we know we're of this position, beleaguered as we are, because we can see those below us, and those are people who are on benefits, people who are immigrants. Those are the groups that stand out as vulnerable.
Yeah. Although many people were on benefits, voting against the benefits.
Yeah.
That, it's...
Yeah, I was in South Carolina when Gingrich was running in the primaries, and he won the South Carolina primary this a long time ago now by describing Obama as the food stamp president.
Yeah.
And the press in Columbia, South Carolina, I was a visitor there for a semester, asked me if I thought that could work. And I said, well, of course it can't work. Almost every white family in South Carolina knows somebody in their family that's on food stamps, but it worked.
Yeah,
it did.
Yeah.
It worked.
It's an interesting dissociation that's required.
Yeah.
So one of the answers for how we got here does follow from what you're saying now, which is that there was too much focus among Democrats in particular on racial inequality and ethnic and immigration inequality, and that we, or the Democrats, or the left obviously folded in, abandoned the white working class, and that this core group were able to find a home in both the Republican Party, but especially in Trump in particular. What would you say to this? I mean, you've heard this, I'm sure,
Yes.
a million times. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that the truth in it is that Democrats don't have any successful way to talk about class and what they want for working people in the main. I don't think that in answering the kind of charge analysis that you just laid out, we should move to the position that everything's okay with the Democrats where class is concerned, because I think it is a big problem. One of the favorite things after the election, journalistically, was to go to some beleaguered place in Appalachia, Harlan County, historic labor place, now without mines, basically, and to find some poor person who had voted for Trump and was now losing their health insurance.
Right.
And, so the kind of undertone of it was, what a stupid move this was, and fair enough. But the other thing we could ask is, why wasn't the health insurance compelling enough? Why was it only Obamacare and not socialized medicine, not even single payer? Why was it not compelling enough to keep those poor people inside the ranks of the Democratic Party? So I think it's very easy to look at elections and say, this is about the movement of white workers toward Trump, and it's only driven by that. The only way that whiteness comes into it is that whiteness structures the appeals of Trump. Whiteness also structures the lack of appeals of the Democratic Party, that we don't have a full-blown, even social democratic politics, because Democrats are so afraid of being accused of providing benefits that are going to go to people of color. So that you get this really attenuated welfare state, and it's hard to defend it. There's not enough there to defend in a lot of instances. So both those things are true, I think.
That's really interesting. So do you think that the Democrats have not worked hard enough to figure out how to thread that needle between appealing to these class concerns of whites without looking like they're providing benefits? Have they worked hard enough at this, or do you think it's an impossible conundrum, right? The race class problem.
I'd be very interested in what people say about this, but it's mystifying to me in some ways. During the Sanders campaign, which some of us, I'm sure, were involved in, when Ta-Nehisi Coates raised reparations as a possible Sanders demand, as a Sanders supporter, that was so roundly criticized, including by people on the left, as impossibilist politics, and as, you know, and the answer was the Sanders strategy of appealing to the rights of poor people will automatically raise people of color because they're poor. That's never really worked. And most of the social policies that get put on the chopping block are not pro-black social policies. They are universal social policies. Aid to families with dependent children, when Clinton got signed it, ended welfare as we know it. That wasn't a racialized social policy. That was non-racial.
It had been racialized.
But it had,
Right.
So, you know, on the one hand, there hasn't been a way to figure out how to talk about those things in universal terms, or how to not lose that debate to white supremacy. But sometimes I think that the Democrats also haven't tried very hard in that regard.
I mean, it may be possible that there's, the wages of whiteness, which I'd love it if you could just give the audience, both the Du Boisian and your analysis of what that is. But it could be that that it creates a fundamental conflict, right? Because you can't have the wages of whiteness and have the wages of classness simultaneously in a multiracial context.
Yeah.
But so describe just for everyone briefly what wages of whiteness are and how you think they might be playing out now.
During the Reagan presidency, so the Reagan presidency, we had debates a little bit like this, what were called the Reagan Democrats, trade union members, white ethnics, so-called, had voted for New Deal candidates for decades.
Right.
All of a sudden, enough of them, not all, but enough change to deliver 2 elections to Reagan in the 80s. And all of a sudden, you get this outpouring. This is the moment of critical study of whiteness entering the academy. And it's because so many people were concerned, in the same way that a lot of you are here because you're concerned about Trump. So many people were concerned about, where did these Reagan Democrats come from? And so my question, and I had thought about this as a revolutionary for a long time, not just in terms of electoral politics, but my question at that point was, okay, people are talking about white workers all the time. What's the history of these white workers? Where did they come from? And it turns out that the first serious treatment of the white worker in U.S. history was Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. It's anchored around chapters on the black worker, the white worker, and the planter. So the class structure and race structure of the South. And deep into that book, Du Bois is describing the loyalty of whites who don't own property to whites who do own property in the South. And he says they weren't necessarily paid the great material wage, but they were paid what he calls a public and psychological wage.
Right.
And there are wage differentials, too. Some of this is material, and Du Bois very much realized that some of it was material. But this is Du Bois' first time writing really seriously with Freud in mind. He actually meant psychology in a very modern psychology sort of way. And when he says public, he's kind of meaning you can go to the park, to the best park, you can send your kids to the best school, you can live in the best neighborhood. Very like today, for example. Yeah. So he was describing that, and I took it. The title of the book that I wrote about the history of the white worker was The Wages of Whiteness, in tribute to Du Bois's insight, and then also kind of trying to play off of the idea of the wages of sin, that these are wages that are also not worth having and destructive. And the hardest thing, I think, in the critical study of whiteness for many of us has been to engage how whiteness makes whites miserable. It's easy enough to talk about the advantages of whiteness and necessary to talk about the advantages of whiteness. But what Du Bois was driving at, and what, above all, James Baldwin drove at, was to say, how do we talk about the fact that whiteness is a misery-producing machine for people of color, but likewise encourages people to accept miserable lives on the other side of the color line. So when Baldwin collects his essays from the last 30 years of his life in The Price of the Ticket is, for Baldwin, the adoption by white immigrants of white identity, mainstream white identity in the United States. So it's that ability to be able to say, without losing sight of white advantage, or what was the term you used at lunchtime? White priority.
Yeah.
Without losing sight of that, to also be able to talk about the wages of whiteness as something that already limits what people can imagine in terms of a good society. And that's, I think, where Du Bois was going. There's this moment, he introduces it at a point in the book where poor whites are having to decide if they're going to be supporters of radical Reconstruction or not. And he's trying to explain why some do, and they're heroic, ongoing experiments in democracy, but most don't. Right. And they do, when they don't, it's to the detriment of black radicals and Republicans in the South, but it's also, he says, to the detriment of white poor people in the South.
Right. So so it is, in this case, the wages, or sort of, shall we say, the minimum wages of whiteness, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Because it's not that, say, bourgeois or upper middle class whites are at a big disadvantage or are suffering, or are you making a more philosophical claim that these racial categories categories divide and oppress and provide a lot of fear and produce, a spiritual deficit, and that this is the kind of suffering? Or is it that it's an economic matter?
I think both, and mainly the former. I think it's mostly about keeping white people without property out of political coalition with people of color. But there's also a sense, my mom is about to turn 96, and she's fine now, but about 8 years ago she had a stroke, and she had was in a good union. She was a school teacher, has good health care. Nobody in the United States has good health care. I mean, it's just that because the United States has constructed its welfare state in the way that it's constructed, that's so afraid that somebody's going to get over by getting benefit from society, that everybody suffers because of that. Even the super rich can afford very, very good private health care, but we all pay for that. And we all pay for the fact that it's so hard to imagine a different kind of society. It's so hard to have any kind of political imagination that would say this could be very, very different kind of place.
Yeah. So how has critical whiteness studies grappled with this from your perspective? I mean, this is a tough, this seems a lot tougher than the sort of critical breakdown of how whiteness works,
Yeah.
So what would you say has been a successful component of addressing this aspect of it in whiteness studies? Or what's the biggest thing that really has been almost impossible to kind of wrench free?
Well, we haven't caught up with Baldwin, I think,
none of us
in
have.
many ways. And it's Baldwin, I'm going to South Africa right after this, and I don't know, some of you maybe are
Straight from Providence?
No, not exactly.
Okay, I was going to say.
2 days of teaching.
Okay.
If you've been to South Africa recently, there's so much panic about crime. And there's quite a bit of crime also in South Africa. But one of the things I want to try to talk about in South Africa is Baldwin has this line where he says that one of the most pernicious effects of whiteness has been to allow people to believe in an illusion of safety. Mm-hmm. And I think this is very much goes to the heart of Trump, that if it weren't for the criminal Mexican, if it weren't for the interloping African American, if there, you could have a perfectly safe
all white
society.
world, yeah.
And who's writing about that now? And I know it as a problem, and still can't figure out a way to really write about it without putting that, without worrying that to put that minus for white people out there somehow detracts from the minus for everybody else in society. Right. It's not an easy thing
to write about,
to do.
Yeah.
That's why I was so interested. Is it Shannon Sullivan?
Yeah, the white priority.
Yeah.
No, at lunch we were talking about drawing distinctions between kinds of racial privilege so that there isn't a kind of absolute hierarchy. Normally, it's common to talk about racial privilege among whites as fixed and complete, as if no one black could have some privileges economically or otherwise, that it's fixed. But if you think of it in more sort of almost privilege as a hierarchical matter within race, Shannon Sullivan talks about this notion of white priority as a way to get at working class white privileges that are not the same as middle class white privileges, and that there can be middle class blacks who have economic privilege that don't immediately get, I don't want to use the word trumped, but it's what's coming to mind, by white priority. So it's a nuanced way of thinking about, the resistance among working class whites to say, what are you talking about white privilege? I'm poor. I don't have economic means. I don't have benefits. I don't have a union job, or whatever the complaints are. And sort of how do you talk about how race can be working both as a class disadvantage in specific examples and still generate some ability to talk about this extra component?
I'm really glad to hear of that work. In the introduction to Class, Race, and Marxism, I try to say, I'm not on a campaign for this, but if I could shape the language, it would be the language of white advantage instead of white privilege. And it grew out of, I was speaking on the radio, speaking up in Rochester, New York, and I was on the NPR radio show there, call-in show for an hour, and I bet in an hour the interviewer, who was a great person, said white privilege 35 times. And I had just come to the studio from, these trade unionists had taken me on a tour of Rochester, which is just a devastated town. I mean, it's a completely, it didn't have heavy industry, but it's a classic deindustrialized town. It's got the 5th highest rate of child poverty in the United States. It's, people, there whole neighborhoods where people had lost their mortgage. And so, I went from there. It's the wrong word. It's the wrong, it's like,
right.
There would have been no way to reach those white workers around the term white privilege because they didn't have that experience. Right. So some kind of more nuance. And this is not to say that a lot of great work by activists isn't done under the banner of white privilege and confronting white privilege. I completely understand that. But there's another moment where I think we have to have a little bit of a different word. And also, it shouldn't be that not getting murdered by a cop is a privilege in this society. It's not a privilege. It's kind of what it's human rights.
Yeah. Going briefly back to Baldwin and fear, that I think segues to and the police. The privilege of not being gunned down. Everyone has been debating, who voted for Trump? Was it the working class? But then there's the white women's vote, right? And of course, you might want to invoke your students again. Maybe they have an explanation. But I wonder how much of this ties into this stoking of fear, this racialized fear, right? Because I mean, how have you been thinking about the role of gender in its relationship to the working class as this so-called base, right, which is assumed to be such a masculine, heteronormative worker, but also the fears of race that are being generated and fomented in the ways in which women are both invoked as to be protected, but also their own fear is perpetually stoked. So as soon as you said, oh, if only we could get this environment that's just so, if we didn't have this group and this group and this group, it would be so, I was like, oh, it looks like a Folgers commercial, in some suburban place. Yeah.
And it came right back around in the Alabama election. So I think that 53% of white women voted for more, in an even more
that one doesn't that I don't even know what
clear example of after the charges and all these women right there before you, some of whom were known in the state, and then to be able to garner that kind of vote. So I do think that fear is one. I think in a certain way Trump has gathered all of the single issue voters, and I think a lot of that was an anti-abortion vote, single issue anti-abortion voting, in which women can see themselves as the custodians of that pro-life movement and can sacrifice themselves on that altar, can say, yes, but we have to hold our nose and vote for this guy because abortion is murder. So I think in Kansas, the gun issue so overwhelms everything else that it's the gathering up of all those pro-gun voters. So that's going on. But there's also a sense, I think, because this is also, the Moore election was right at the beginning to be the beginning of the Me Too movement, which is really resonant. And it's not that movement doesn't exist, and it's not that it doesn't exist in Alabama and people aren't retweeting things to each other in fundamentalist churches in Alabama. It's a real issue, but there's still a sense in which white womanhood has connections to white masculinity that it's asking a lot to deny. Cheryl Harris everybody knows Cheryl Harris's wonderful article, Whiteness is Property, in Harvard Law Review from the mid-90s. I think the best thing that's been written on whiteness in my generation. But right after that, she wrote an article in Cardozo Law Review, equally long and equally great, called Finding Sojourner's Truth. And she kind of anchors it in the story of Sojourner Truth and Sojourner Truth's lost child. And she says, what's the difference in 1840 between white womanhood and African-American womanhood? And she says, more or less, white womanhood could only give birth to freedom, and black womanhood could only give birth to slavery. And, that's a web of relationships that roots a lot of further relationships. So, you're asking a lot. I mean, it's necessary to ask a lot, but you're confronting some real material, long-standing things when white women decide to stick with white men, even when those white men are abusive.
Yeah. I mean, I also think, it's sort of absurd to assume that women are feminists because they're women. If that were the case, we would have solved a whole lot a long time ago. So it doesn't surprise me that much. But what I think is important is the way people made that assumption, particularly among Democrats, right? That what were these women voting for? Like they're just born feminists or born, liberal feminists in particular.
Yeah.
So there's all these potential intersecting dynamics, factions, fractures that you're describing, histories that are intertwined, but also, limiting our imagination. But we're still being asked from the left, the most, it seems to me, that with an insistence that this is the time to talk really race neutrally, that we need to, presumably class only. I'm not sure what replaces race. I want to hear what you have to say about that. But that basically we have to create unity through the emphasis of an overarching category that always seems to involve the erasure of race as a point of interpretation, understanding, et cetera.
Yeah.
This is an old debate, but for it to be back with such a vengeance, it just strikes me as odd. It seems to me so obvious that it's not going to work, but maybe I'm just, being unreasonable. What do you think's going on with that?
I like the old debates. I'm a historian. And
yeah.
It gives me
You're like, do it again.
Go back a little bit. So I'll only go back to the mid-1990s.
Okay, well, that's not too bad.
We talked about this at lunch a little bit today. In the Clinton triumph, the Bill Clinton triumph, one of the key counties, the key county for his campaign was Macomb County outside of Detroit. Anybody from that area? His advisors, including the academic Stanley Greenberg, who became his pollster, went to Macomb County and tried to figure out what it was that made these white Reagan Democrats tick. Mm-hmm. And they said, we're going to only hold interviews, focus group interviews, in the homes and institutions of Macomb County. Now, a lot of these were auto workers, and they worked in plants that were very, very integrated plants. But the idea was that you paid attention to the issues of these Reagan Democrats in their homes, in their counties. Mm-hmm. At that time, Macomb County was, I think, about 95% white, and some with sundown towns properly. Mm-hmm. That research was funded by the Automobile Workers Union. It was funded by the UAW. And yet it skewed entirely to saying, let's define this problem as a problem not of workers, but of middle-class people. And sometimes, so Stanley Greenberg's book on this triumph in the election was called Middle Class Dreams. Mm-hmm. And that they convened these focus groups as middle-class people who had to be not politically appealed to, but paid attention to.
Right.
And the focus groups revealed that integrated schools were a problem, busing was a problem, crime was a problem, all of the kind of buzzword, code word issues. Mm-hmm. And then Clinton's campaign promised to end welfare as we know it, promised to mend affirmative action, 3 strikes and you're out, the Effective Death Penalty Act, all of those things become Clinton-era reforms, and they rest on this idea that we're paying attention to white workers. Mm-hmm. Macomb County, my great student Taya Miles has a new book on the early history of Detroit, and it turns out that Macomb was the biggest slaveholder in that area, and it becomes then this county of sundown towns later on. In the 2016 election, Trump's strategists made Macomb County their key they called it a laboratory.
Wow.
For returning the Republicans to they thought if we can figure out a way to win that county, and they did resoundingly figure out a way to pay attention to the issues of white workers. So I think that there's this way in which we have to be very careful. One of the things that will happen now in the next round of primaries is there'll be Democratic candidates who say, I know how to listen to the concerns of white workers.
Right. And
they'll be listening to the concerns in a certain kind of environment, which is not the only environment. I wanted to say one more thing about that, because this was the moment when I was writing Wages of Whiteness, and then it came out, and I was lecturing about it. And I was doing a lot of summer schools for the Automobile Workers Union at that time. I was telling people at lunch that I would go into those summer schools and I'd say to maybe 3/4 white workers, 1/4 African-American workers at that time, why would anybody, my work is about, here's what I'm interested in, my work is about why would anybody call themselves a white worker? I get how you call yourself white, I get how you call yourself a worker, but why do you want to call, why would anybody want to call yourself a white worker? And the white workers answered that question. And they said, oh, it's because you can get a job in the skilled trades in the automobile industry. You can live wherever you want. You can send your kids to good schools. You can get a home loan. The police don't bother you as much. Of course people will call themselves a white worker. So alongside that kind of stuff that was being relayed in the homes of Macomb County in terms of white supremacist rhetorics about black people, there was a whole other available discourse even at that moment that could have been talked about and tapped into. So, yeah.
Right. So it sounds like there's a kind of continuum of whiteness here going on, right? I mean, but they've been divided into the good and bad whites, right? The liberal whites as the good ones, and these conservative or unintelligent somehow because they're working against their own best interests. But can you talk a bit about whether or not they're on a spectrum? How do you think about ways of being white, and whether or not there are ways of transforming that? Because it does. I mean, given all the investments we know, it's not like the category is going away.
Right.
And you know, some could argue that certain kinds of whiteness has been cultivated over the past 30 or 40 years to get us here. It's not a fixed thing. It's a constructed matter that's reinforced and highlighted. And it's reinforced with benefits, with resources, and it's reinforced with rhetoric and ideology. But I'm just wondering how we think about it, whether or not it's on a continuum, whether or not there are, you know, value judgments that you want to make. How do you think about the breadth of the category, and can we do more with it in a progressive way? You know, can we create progressive, you know, can we have the anti-Fox network, you know, that does the opposite? You know,
Air America.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, so much for that. Yeah, that was a success. But you know, something that cultivates a progressive, multiracially comfortable kind of whiteness, right? How's that possible? And how do you see the category operating, you know, overall?
Well, first of all, I sometimes think, and with the restrictions on immigration now, this may not quite be true, but I've sometimes worried about the critical study of whiteness as taking up so much space talking about whiteness. I've argued in places that the most important kind of interracial unity in the United States is black-brown unity now, and that black-white unity has been is about to be superseded in that regard. So I think that one thing we have to watch out for is to kind of do the dream work of white supremacists for them by assuming that whites are always going to be the key constituency, and that everything that matters in the United States is going to be associated with whiteness. After the election, a graduate student and I did this small study that was about Wisconsin. And we wanted to try to find out how voters in sundown towns, I knew from Joe Fagan, the sociologist, that over half of all towns in Wisconsin are sundown towns, that is, towns where black people had to be out of town by sundown, and they remain less than 1% African American to this day. So the student and I wanted to find out how those towns voted, because so much of what we were hearing was acting as if changes in white opinion were the product of actual knowledge and experience with people of color. And so we looked at these we couldn't get the data for towns. We looked at counties with a sundown town as their county seat, which it turns out is 58 out of 72 counties in Wisconsin have sundown towns for a county seat. And sure enough, Clinton barely lost Wisconsin. You could easily say that those sundown towns, which kind of in the press stood in for rural, poor, backwards, et cetera, they weren't always, but those sundown towns delivered the state to Trump. But two other things were present. One was, by far greater than that, was suburban Milwaukee, educated people, middle-class whites, educated whites who voted for Trump. Then they voted for the Republican candidate in every election as far back as, and even more, they voted for Trump. That group gets missed. It's that educated racist group that we have trouble identifying and talking about. It's much more easy for the press to talk about the Appalachian worker or the rural Wisconsin. But then I talked to Jim Lowen, who does this great work on sundown towns, and told him about this article, and he said, oh, take a look at those same counties in the 2008 election. And in the 2008 election, those 58 counties with all white towns as their county seat overwhelmingly voted for Obama. 55 to 45.
Why?
They voted for Obama. They're desperate places, change. They're places that if they're going to survive at all as a county, they need a strong state. You know, I think it's important to realize that these things are at least a certain amount fluid. And so when you say, where can we tap in, I don't think it's so much a matter of the biggest swing in a county was in a county called Calhoun County in Illinois, not too far from where I grew up. And it went from 70-30 for Obama to 70-30 for Trump in the space of eight years. And my son was, for a time, a legal aid attorney that served that county. And he said everything got shut down in that county, very, 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 very poor county that still had public housing through rural agricultural administration homes. They all got shut. The Social Security office got shut. The experience of austerity in that county was part of what
Obama.
So it's about race. It's certainly, and one of the things I hope we talk about, at least in the question and answer. So the way that Trump and it has highlighted immigration, maybe even more than anti-black racism in his public appeals. All of that, I don't want to deny at all, but there are some other things that we could attend to.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Black and Brown Alliance you referenced, because that seems particularly productive around, fighting anti-black racism and fighting the racism of immigration. So, how important is race to the anti-immigration strategy and impulse in not just in Trump but in his supporters and others?
One of this was happenstance, but one of the things that really struck me in the last month was when Trump did the shithole country thing, which itself deserves some attention. It's an interesting example of we say we're against structural racism, but it's when words get used. What was really outrageous about Trump in the shithole country things was that he was openly saying, I'm going to discriminate against people on the basis of race. That was about policy. And nobody really very much attended to the policy. It was the bad words associated with the policy. Both are reprehensible, but we do have to be able to talk about structural racism when we talk about Trump's rhetoric. What was your question?
Racism and anti-immigrant policy. You're right on it. So that day after I think the night before he's issued this shithole country thing, and then the day after was the King holiday celebration. And Trump really made a big thing out of the King holiday celebration. And a few people who were invited protested, and some people didn't come.
but mostly he pulled it off. And it reminded me of the way that during the campaign, there was plenty of anti-black racism in the Trump campaign, but at critical junctures, he chose to lead with the issue of immigration rather than confront the kind of moral high ground that the civil rights movement, I think, still occupies in some ways in the United States. And so I think that one of the things that's interesting about Trump is that he's got policies to hurt immigrants. And he's got rhetoric to hurt African Americans and policies as well. But there's this way in which he's pushing anti-immigration so far that it challenges us to think about how to build an alliance that defends immigrant rights and African American rights at the same time. He's sort of giving us that task, I think, by the very way that he's so using anti-immigration and in that shithole country thing, anti-globalization, I think, to a certain extent, to kind of define problems as being about outsiders. There's a great British sociologist who I recommend a lot named Satnam Virdi, who has a book called Class, Race, and the Racialized Outsider. And this concept of racialized outsider that he's theorized, I think, is really, really deeply important in the United States now, to think about people who are kind of racially on trial. They're just here. They're and then maybe 40 years from now, they'll be of the same ethnicity, but not in that same exposed position that they are, especially if they're undocumented. But so this is the black-brown one, I think, is an issue that Trump poses for us, and it's an opportunity as well.
It's an opportunity. Yeah, for sure. And certainly the criminalization, the rendering of various immigrant groups as non-white and their criminalization could be an important source of sort of connective tissue for mobilization.
Yeah. It's also a challenge for the anti-incarceration movement because some right-wingers are getting interested in shrinking the size of prisons and thinking that you can use new technologies to police people outside of prisons and maybe make money off of those technologies. But immigration prisons are making up the slack. So the issues are actually posed in real life for us, I think.
Exactly. So trying to study white supremacy, this and one last question, we'll throw it open to the audience. Studying white supremacy is getting a lot of attention on campuses. You can study African American history. It doesn't usually generate the same level of hate mail. It gets it, but there's been a tremendous outrage about the handful of courses in a few places that are tackling just the historical formation of white supremacy. Can you speak to that? I mean, is this a moment for whiteness studies that's politically valuable? How much intimidation are you seeing in the field? What's your sense?
Tricia asked me at lunch if I've gotten death threats recently, and I haven't actually, but there's so many people just down the road at Trinity, at Drexel. There have been case after case of people, particularly who study whiteness, who fall victim to this kind of outrage media coverage that, oh my God, people are in classrooms discriminating against white students. It's so old. 1992, I was asked to be on Fox and kindred shows. I was asked to drive to Chicago in order that people could yell at me and berate me on right-wing TV shows because and then it was like, oh my God, there's this new thing called the critical study. They called it Whiteness Studies, and we should all be up in arms about it. And so now, over a period of decades, every 2 or 3 years, like clockwork, there's a series of shows on Fox and other right-wing networks saying, we just found out that this thing called Whiteness Studies, and your kids are being exposed to it. And it's a tricky business because, some of us are anti-white in the sense that we think that whiteness is an ideology that's caused a lot of misery in the world. And so it's easy enough in the case of Johnny Williams at Trinity, it's easy enough to find an out-of-context quote where somebody says, I don't wish good fortune to whiteness. I wish it would disappear. And then that becomes genocidal. And it actually is an example of we can't critically study whiteness without being able to say that whiteness is harmful and doesn't help white people. And so when that threat is made, we have to find some way.
Right.
I was absolved from it because I was always able to say, I've never taught a course on whiteness and never would. I consider whiteness, all part of people who teach such courses, but I consider whiteness to be part of ethnic studies. If you're going to critically study whiteness, I think it grows out of and is best embedded in ethnic studies. So I've never, whenever people say, why don't you come on and talk about your terrible course in whiteness studies, I'm always able to say, no, that's not me. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good move, if for no other reason. So what do you think the post-Trump landscape will look like? I mean, who knows? But what would you say at this point?
The thing that's interested me in policy terms.
There's going to be a post-Trump landscape. There will be. That's a fact.
We just have to make sure.
You heard it here.
We just have to make sure there's still a landscape.
Yeah.
Post-Trump landscape.
Yeah, good point.
But one of the things that's interested me about the tax policy is how little there was of mobilization in the streets against the tax bill compared to some of the other things, and how we're hardly hearing anybody in opposition to Trump saying, if we win the midterm elections, we'll repeal this tax policy. It's very interesting. So I think that the important intellectual and political debates are going to be about, are we getting rid of Trump? Are we getting rid of the kind of ideas that Trump pushed, the policies that Trump pushed?
Right.
And I think that's a big one. Are Democratic politicians going to be willing to say, we describe this as a disaster for working people, and as soon as we get an opportunity, we're going to get rid of that disaster? And you can write that in a lot of different ways, or apply it in a lot of different ways. Are we against anti-immigrant saber rattling because Trump is doing it? Or are we also cognizant of the fact that those deportations were going on
under Obama
at about the same rate?
Yep.
And so, I think that's one of the challenges of the post-Trump landscape, is whether there can be a kind of a meaningful, radical, anti-racist response that moves
the needle
beyond the alternatives that we've had so far.
Right.
There will be more Trumps, less outrageous, but same deal, or more outrageous.
That's the question.
So, if we don't attend to some of those matters, there will always be people. There's a sense in which whiteness is a self-fulfilling proposition that white people. People always ask me, I was lecturing in a prison in central Illinois not too long ago, and 80 black inmates, 20 Latino inmates, and they had read Working Toward Whiteness, which is about the early 20th century. And they had one question on all of their minds, and at the very end, somebody finally asked it and said, are Latinos going to become white? And both the Latino inmates and the black inmates were really interested in that question for very good reasons. They were trying to figure out how to get along with each other, and they were being really honest. But as long as whiteness means having 11 times as much wealth as African Americans, people in immigrant populations are going to want to become white. I mean, it's a material fact that if you don't address that differential, there's a compelling material incentive to think about yourself as becoming white in the United States. So structural things are needed to change
Right.
that. It's not just about, having a more civil president.
No, definitely not. Well, we're going to take some questions, but first I just want to thank David Roediger for this great conversation. Thank you.